Thanks for joining us today on the Tank Podcast. My name is Hogan Gidley. Today, Chad Wolf and I will sit down with a former national security advisor to former President Donald Trump and co-chair of the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. The always happy, the always smiling, well, sometimes, but the incomparable General Keith Kellogg. Welcome to the Tank.
Coming to you from our nation's capital, this is The Tank, your voice in Washington, D.C. and around the country. Broadcasting from the America First Policy Institute offices in D.C., this is the premier think tank podcast where we discuss the challenges facing our nation, talk policy, and advance America First solutions. Welcome to The Tank.
Hello, this is Chad Wolf.
And this is Hogan Gidley.
Coming up, Hogan and I will sit down with General Keith Kellogg. But first, we wanted to take a few minutes to talk about a couple of issues that are important to Americans and that are being covered in the news today. So we're going to jump right on in with talk of this prisoner swap between the United States and Iran. But it's not only a prisoner swap, Hogan. It's also a good amount of money being exchanged as well, $6 billion to be exact. So I'm not sure where to begin. Of course, this was all announced on the anniversary of 9/11, which is kind of odd, I would say. And I think a lot of Americans kind of scratching their heads saying, what's going on? And why did you pick that day of every day to announce kind of, I would say, a controversial program?
The most egregious, most horrific act of terrorism on our soil, 9/11. And you choose that day to give $6 billion to the world's largest state sponsor of terror in Iran makes absolutely no sense. Talk about a slap in the face to all those who died when the Twin Towers collapsed, all those who died since because of lung problems and all types of issues. This administration has been tone deaf on issue after issue, but for this one, it's egregious in so many ways. Forget the fact for a moment that this president decided to break protocol and not be in Washington or Pennsylvania or New York.
No way, he's in Alaska.
He was in Alaska at Elmendorf Air Force Base. I've been there. It's a great place. But really...
Well, you know why he was there. It's a stopover coming back from Asia.
Yeah, of course. And that's where we stopped.
It's a refueling stop.
We stopped over to refuel there, but we didn't have some big speech on a historic, momentous day and just say, look, I'm already here. I might as well just bang out a speech. And when he started the speech, he gave some ridiculous joke about how he could have been an All-American in football had he had. I mean, it's so bad in so many ways. And you just hit on something. We're talking about a prisoner swap, 5 for 5. We gave them 5 of their prisoners. They're giving us 5 of ours. Ours didn't threaten terrorism to the government of Iran. They were just captured, number one. Number two, you'd say if it were 5 for 5, we'd still be saying, hey, I don't know if you negotiate with terrorists, not the right thing. We understand. But 5 for 5 makes sense, at least from a number standpoint. But just to sweeten the deal, let's also give their government $6 billion, which they have admitted they're going to use any way they want to. And our government says, yeah, they'll probably use it for terrorism.
But again, the $6 billion was designated for humanitarian relief of some sorts. But I mean, if you're the Biden administration, I guess you're trying to tell the American people that with a straight face. But
if by humanitarian aid you mean suicide bombs, then yes, humanitarian aid.
There's absolutely no accountability. There's no way to actually determine in 6 months, 12 months, or 2 years from now whether that money is actually what that money is going to. And the Biden administration, either they're incredibly incompetent or they know this. And I think it's more of the latter, I think. They know this, and either they don't care or they don't think the American people are going to catch on. But it is incredibly dishonest. It's dangerous. And you combine this with what they did in Afghanistan. And overall, it's not only making Americans overseas and our allies overseas less secure, it's making Americans here in the homeland less secure.
Yeah, and I know we have to talk about it because it is in the news right now, but we also had a very special guest. We've already taped a podcast for the next couple of weeks with someone who knows this issue very well, who's on top of this, Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa. Yeah. So I don't want to get too far ahead on this issue. People are angry about it, so we definitely want to address it. But there is another issue actually that kind of popped over the weekend too, that has been a consistent issue, an area of idiocy, lunacy for this administration, and that's the southern border, something you know very well.
Here we go.
And for the life of me, I can't figure out why there's not more coverage on this in the media, why we're not talking about this on every newscast and broadcast, from coast to coast, from sea to shining sea, because this is going to fundamentally change our country for generations to come, allowing people to come across this border in a way. And look, guys, we just had new numbers come out. You and I were talking about this before. 35,000 people in, what'd you say, 4 days?
4 days.
Now, the Obama administration, their border person, was it Jay Johnson, said 1,000 in a day was a real problem. They didn't have the people to process them. It was a big issue. It was a crisis for 1,000 a day. You're talking about more than 9,000 a day for multiple days in a row, and it's almost like radio silence from the media.
Oh, I could go on. It's like a toy you wind up and you let it go, because I've got a lot of thoughts here. But I would say the Biden administration has tried to establish a new normal that letting in somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 individuals a day into the country over the last 2.5 years is somehow okay. And then when you get these spikes on top of an already baseline that is spiked already, that's where you find ourselves today when we're about 9,500 to 10,000 individuals streaming across that border. Some are claiming asylum, some are trying to evade law enforcement and the like. But here's the danger in this, which is there's nowhere to put these individuals. Border Patrol has run out of space. Shelters have run out of space. So they're being mass released into American communities. And so what this administration is trying to tell the American people is, don't worry, we'll somehow care for them all. But the reality is they don't know where they go. And the reality is that communities, and we hear this, New York City, El Paso, Chicago, they don't want them there. They did want them. They did want them there until they actually started showing up, and now they don't want them there.
When it's in theory and it's virtue signaling, and watch me be so welcoming to people and have the signage up that says, "Hey, I don't know what their problem is in Texas. We want them here. We're a sanctuary city. You are welcome here. We're a melting pot." And then they show up and they're like, "Hey." Like 1,000 people show up. They're like, we don't have where to put them. We don't know what to do here. It's not the tens of thousands at the southern border every day. It's so infuriating. And you worked so closely on this. And to see all the work you did, and I say me too, I guess I was part of it as well in the administration previous, going through all of the policy prescriptions that gave us record low numbers of people crossing, yes, but human trafficking and child smuggling, and to see people coming across, video you and I just watched in my office with the wristbands on from the cartels to let them know they paid a cartel to get them there. I mean, the cartels are in control of the border.
Yeah, when I think about service at Department of Homeland Security and what these Border Patrol agents are going through today, because I've talked to them, I know what their concerns are. They are beyond frustrated because they feel like their hands are tied, that they've been hired and trained to do a certain job, and this administration doesn't care. And so what the Border Patrol have been turned into is a instead of a national security organization and an agency that's supposed to keep bad people and bad things out of the country, they've been turned into a migrant processing agency. And that's all their job is to do now, is to take them in, process them as quickly as I can, and release them. And I need Americans to wake up to this fact that it is not just good people trying to come across this border. There are bad people in the world. And when you have 9,000 to 10,000 coming across that border every day, how many is okay? How many bad people is it allowed to come across that border? Are you comfortable with? I think my number is close to zero. But that's what the Biden administration is trying to tell the American people, that they know, and they've admitted this. They know there are bad people in this flow, but that through some law enforcement techniques and other things, they can weed them out, which they can't. I know this for a fact. and that there's some level of risk that they accept here.
Let me ask you then a policy question, because what I can't figure out is when you see these people pouring across the border, you see the administration say, look, here's how you fix it. We need more money for more judges, more money to pay for these agents down at the border, et cetera, et cetera. When my concern isn't more money per se, it's fewer people. Like, why don't you just stop the flow of people? Then you don't need the money. And by the way, even with the people coming across, I don't know that money's the answer, because the administration isn't allowing the border patrol to do what they're supposed to do as their job description to stop the flow. Yeah. It's just money for more processing and babysitting in essence.
Yeah, so there's never really been a problem that DC's looked at where they don't think more money is the solution.
Right.
And that's what's going on here. And look, I see different congressmen on television. Look, Republicans and Democrats, they're saying, oh, we need more money down there. That'll fix the problem. No. It only fixes the problem because you've created such a huge problem yourself that you think that money's going to solve it. You've got to change policies. You've got to change tactics. You got to bring enforcement back and consequences back. You may need some money, interim money, and right now, but in time, it should settle out. There are ways to address this. The Biden administration is trying to convince the American people that this is normal, in that there are hemispheric migration pattern changes occurring. I mean, that's hard to say. I mean, you're laughing. It's hard to stay with a straight face. And it brings me back to this point. So after Title 42, which ended early part of May, there was a dip in numbers, in these numbers that we're talking about, the latter half of May and then all of June. And the Biden administration was standing on every chair and every table that they could find and saying, look, our policies are working. They're working and the numbers are coming down. As soon as the numbers go back up, it's hemispheric migration patterns and seasonal changes. And someone just needs to ask them the question, well, if it was your policies that made the numbers go down, maybe it's your policies that are making them go back up, because the smugglers and the traffickers have gotten used to your policies, and then there's no teeth there. And so they've changed tactics, and this is the end result. But I go back to, and I know we could talk about this for a long time. This is not normal. The American people should not accept this as normality. It's so far from what should be occurring. We're the only country, I've said this before, the only country in the world that treats their border, that lets 9,000 to 10,000 individuals come across that border, and we have no idea who they are. Only country in the world.
This may spark something, so I'm going to say this anyway. And if we have a problem, that's true. I mean, how many people in Russia, let me phrase it this way. How many Russian troops crossed the Ukrainian border when they first invaded Ukraine?
Thousands.
9,000? Was it 34,000 in 4 days? You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
Here's a question. We have all these people coming across our southern border, and for whatever reason, our politicians think this is okay.
Yeah.
I don't understand. You cannot treat a sovereign border this way unless, of course, the left doesn't believe we have a sovereign border, or should, which I think is the case here. The characterization of this, and I always talk about, because my background's in media and television, et cetera, comms. Bias occurs in two ways. It's what you cover and how you cover it. So if the media is not going to cover this situation at all, that's bias in a form of omission. They're not telling everyone what's going on the southern border. When they do cover it, and they say, these are mostly just families looking for a better way of life, a job, fleeing persecution, prosecutions in their home countries, then they're covering it in a way that's biased, because they're not giving you the full picture of the people on the terrorist watch list who've been captured at the border. The Chinese people who've been caught coming across the southern border. Was it Uzbekistan people coming across the southern border? All these things then aren't covered in a way where fentanyl comes across the southern border, but they're not telling you it comes from China, blah.
Yeah.
They omit that. So there's the bias that doesn't tell the full picture, thus creating a situation where the people aren't as outraged as they should be, because remember, you control the message, you control the masses. And these people are controlling a message that isn't true and isn't fulsome, and the American people are in the dark on a lot of it because they're not hearing about it.
Yeah, that's right. I saw some reporting today from NBC. I'm just going to call them out. They talked about 75 to 8,000 migrants alone on this past weekend, the past Sunday. And in there, just embedded in the first or second sentence said, well, the Biden administration's policies may be the result, may be the cause of this. There's no may there. It should just be they are the result, or they are the cause of this. And so by putting in little phrases in there, you're planting a seed with the American people. Well, maybe they're not really to blame here. Maybe it is this hemispheric migration pattern that Secretary Mayorkas has dreamed up and talks about. And so it's these little things, to your point, that I think that that legacy media tries to do. I mean, look, you don't. It's a good example. Where's AOC in the middle of this, right? So in 19
shouted down in New York.
Well, she was, but in 2019, she handcuffed herself to Border Patrol facilities.
In a white suit.
In a white suit. That
feigning sadness.
1/4 of the numbers and the misery and the humanitarian crisis that we see today, and she hasn't been to the border one time. That someone in the media should do their job and talk about why is that.
The line you use, though, is so telling that it may have caused, right? The interesting thing about that, and I'll get a little deeper here in the journalistic viewpoint of this, that's an editorialized sentence, because the person writing it or the person saying it should be attributing a sentence like that to somebody, an expert one way or the other. And in theory, what you should have are two different sides.
Yeah.
You should have someone from the administration going, it's the climate that caused it or whatever. Then you should have someone from the other side saying, look, here are the policies that have really made this situation a crisis, and it's the Biden's administration's fault, whatever. For the reporter themselves to say it may be because of this, because the opposite of maybe is maybe not. So it's pretty clear they're setting themselves up to try and, I guess, blunt the sharpness of the reality by using words like may. That's where it gets really frustrating for me as a former journalist. Was I had a professor in college who I loved to death, but he was a Marxist, socialist, atheist. But if you put an editorialized word like may without attributing it to somebody in a story, he failed it every time. And that's why I loved him so much. But he also showed me to look out for things like this. So when I see it on TV, it's so infuriating because I know what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're trying to carry water for the political position they themselves hold. So they're going to blunt the sharpness, or they're going to kind of ratchet it up where they need to try and push their own narrative, not reality. And I spoke to someone actually very close to a prominent politician who made the comment to me, as we go off on this little tangent for a moment, that their in-laws, she was shocked by this. They had gone to a weekend away at some lake or something. Their in-laws had no idea about border numbers. They did not know Hunter Biden had been indicted. They did not know any of the potential bribery charges. No idea. And when she pressed her in-laws on why is that, their response was, well, it's not on the news. She asked, what news are you watching? And it was all the players you would think of.
Yeah.
It was the CNNs, it was the MSNBCs who don't report it. That's what is so infuriating, because so much of what we hear is not the whole story or any of the story. And so the American people are out there not stupid, but ignorant, because they're not being told something that is obviously news that obviously impacts their lives. And when they are told it, as I said, it's told in a way that doesn't tell you whose fault it is. So it's no wonder we got here, I guess.
And I would just say, other than maybe Fox News and a few others, Newsmax that are covering this issue, no one would be talking about it. But you do see some polling here where this administration continues to be underwater on how they've been handling the border. Now, I think they should be well underwater more than they are because it's an outright disaster. But look, we could continue to talk about this, and we will, because we sit here, almost the 19th of September, and the August border numbers are still not out. Well, that's odd. It's 20 days after the month of August has ended. I know from a fact it takes them about 3 to 4 days to tally those numbers, deconflict some of the numbers, make sure they've got accurate numbers. It does not take 19 days. And so what does it tell you? My guess is you'll see these numbers released on a Friday, maybe even, they're probably looking for a holiday in the month of September. I don't think there's one that they're looking for to dump these numbers. But I'm also hearing that September, because we're 20 days into it, will likely be the highest month on record ever, which is just astronomical given the numbers that we've seen to date.
You understand the ridiculousness of saying it doesn't take 4 days to come up with these numbers. I'm saying that's the right thing to say. The ridiculousness of saying, wait a minute, at the end of every week, we give you numbers for the week. We give you overnight numbers for the day, and no one's sitting around going, hey, I could add these up.
Right.
It's just a handful of numbers. You know what I mean? So it's very clear what they're trying to do, as you said. And for those listening, the Friday afternoon news dump is a real thing when you don't want the news to really get home to the American people. It's something started under the Clinton administration, did a great job. When it was bad news, they released it on Friday afternoon so that Saturday, you're out, you're enjoying, you're not paying attention to news Friday night. You
College
got Saturday football, you got football. Sunday, you got football, you got church, you got all these things. No one's paying attention to the news. And by 2 days, then the press, in their little dutiful water-carrying mentality, by Monday, see, it's old news because it's 2 days old. Then why would we cover it on Monday?
So just to wrap this up, a good Friday dump, to your point, that the Biden administration had last Friday, is they released a Homeland Security threat assessment for the country on Friday. And so for the last 2.5 years, I don't know about all our listeners, but I've been told by this administration that white supremacy is the number one threat to the homeland.
Sure.
President Biden was up here at Howard University this year. White supremacy. Someone needs to tell the Department of Homeland Security, because in their threat assessment, that's not the biggest threat to the homeland.
What was it?
Illegal drugs, fentanyl, and a failed border strategy. That last part I put in there, but because
that's why we have the
that's
fentanyl.
why you have it, right?
Yeah.
And so someone needs to tell the professionals over at DHS that they didn't get the political talking points from this administration. And so now there's confusion within the department. Well, what is the biggest threat to the homeland? What is killing more Americans every single day? Is it white supremacists, or is it actual fentanyl at the hands of the cartels because of a porous border? And we don't have to wonder anymore. They let it be known. But I thought it was interesting. They released this late Friday. If they're super proud of it and they want to tout it, they want to do a press conference on it, it doesn't come out on a Friday.
That's right.
So anyway, more to come on this, because we've got numbers coming over the next couple of months, and I think this is an important topic. Obviously, I've got a vested interest to know something about it.
Yeah.
But it'll be good to continue.
But everyone does, because this matters to the country. So I don't want you to get tired of this topic, because this is a serious topic, and you have such intimate knowledge of how this works. And I've been to the border with the former president. I went down there. I've worked with the messaging on the policy, et cetera. It matters, and it's also not stopping. It continues, so it is important.
All right. Let's move on to our interview. Well, we're pleased to be joined today by General Keith Kellogg. General Kellogg served as not only the National Security Advisor for former Vice President Mike Pence, but also acting National Security Advisor for former President Donald Trump. Served over 33 years in the Army, so thank you, sir, for your service. Also Chief of Staff to the National Security Council. Again, General Kellogg's a retired three-star, committed his time and really his life to the country. And that continues here at AFPI, where he is a co-chair of our Center for American Security, along with Director John Radcliffe, Secretary Robert Wilkie, Fred Fleitz, and others. So you can also find General Kellogg frequently on Fox News, commenting on a lot of the actions and activities of the day as it relates to national security. So, General, pleasure to have you here. Welcome to the tank.
Chad, thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
Well, General Kellogg, it goes without saying, I think you were one of the highlights of my time in the administration, in large part because no matter where we were, no matter what was going on, you were just always happy. And, what's not in this wonderful introduction that Chad gave you in your resume is you're just a good dude. And you're fun to be around. And as serious as foreign policy is and as serious as the things we dealt with were in the White House, I want to start kind of talking about your career and how you got to where you are, because it really is long and it is storied for sure. But tell us first, because I brought this up, you're such a positive person, and when we're facing so many serious issues, what keeps you so not just level-headed but positive about things in general?
Yeah, well, first of all, Hogan, thanks for those comments. I really do appreciate it. I think part of it, I kind of grew up that way, where I came through a family that was always very positive. But then, as I went through the military career, over 30 years in the military, and I always believed that, and I used to tell my young commanders, you're always on parade. What I mean by it, meaning you're always on parade. When you're and the more senior you get, more so, people look at you, and you have to have an attitude that shows confidence. You know what you're doing. You're kind of happy to be where you're at. So it kind of bleeds into everybody else looking at you. If you're a downer, you're not happy about it, then people are going to kind of pick up that attitude as well. And that carried through not only in the military, but also in the business world. And then when I came into the White House, of course, a lot of times I was smiling because I couldn't believe where I was at. But the fact is, you have to be positive about it, because and you know that and you and Chad both, from being in the White House and seeing how things work there. Every day is a challenge. Every day you're faced with enormous decisions. None of them are easy. You know that any decision you make, half the time you're going to be, opposed by half the country, and the other half's going to like you. And you have to be very, very positive about it and show that you're confident in your decision making. And I think that was part of it, where I just want to make sure that people say, okay, you're confident that this is the way it's going to go. It's going to work out. Everybody relax, because a lot of times junior staffers around you, they'd be wringing their hands in a negative manner. Will we okay? Is this really going to work? And say, look, we're going to be fine. Just everybody relax and keep a good attitude about it.
And it wasn't Pollyanna-ish, Chad. It was like he has a leadership ability, as you can obviously tell in this interview, and we know him, so the people listening out there just understand he's a leader. But it's that type of, a lot of us are facing things we'd never even thought we'd face before, right, and the gravity of those moments. And someone like the general had that attitude of just, hey, everything's fine. It made you, it gave you a little pep in your step. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, the term I use often is grown up in the room, right? Yeah. You have the grown up.
I wouldn't go that far.
Well, he's in the room with you.
That's true.
By far, the grown up. But no, and what I mean by that is it's not only, there's years of experience, yes, that the general has, but he's been in stressful combat.
Yeah,
I mean, stressful situations before. So whatever you're encountering in the White House, which was also very stressful, it's sort of like, I've been here before. I know what this feels like. I know that the sun will rise tomorrow. We'll get through this, level-headed. And I think particularly, when you come into a new administration, particularly the Trump administration, you have a lot of new faces, new folks in there, some of them doing it for the first time, and they want to be reassured that they're doing the right thing for the right reasons. And having someone like the general there, sitting there, gives them that confidence. And then I'll just say one other thing, which you kind of led with, Hogan, is what we call people like the general are happy warriors.
Right.
Literally. They're ready for battle. You're ready for battle, but they're going to do it with a smile on the face.
And I have to give you one quick example. When I commanded the Army's 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Liberty, then Fort Bragg. I'm always going to call it Fort Bragg. But I remember being asked that, when the parachute units, you're always dropped behind enemy lines, and, there's a big danger to it. You have to be worried about it. And my reaction to that was, look, I think it's great, because then you can shoot in any direction you want to shoot. You can attack anywhere you want to go. I couldn't be more happier. They kind of look at you like okay, this guy's a little bit nuts. But that's kind of the attitude you have to have. And I don't care if it's in business. I don't care if it's politics. You have to have a positive attitude because of all the negativity that comes at you, from every direction.
Well, speaking of negativity, as we take a turn here into some of the more serious topics we're going to discuss, we heard from Gold Star family members about what they were most upset about as related to not just the way we pulled out, but how their families were treated, how they felt that their fallen family member was treated. Just knowing you've been part of the dignified transfers, for example, and you see people come back in those flag draped coffins. What did that testimony do to you, just emotionally, but also how did you feel the administration could have performed better? Because obviously, I think a lot of Americans are really angry at that situation. So talk about first the testimony itself, how you felt when you heard those family members sharing their hearts.
Yeah, a few things there. Could you bring up a really good point, Hogan, with the Gold Star families? Which is, and I think America owes a special sense of gratitude to those fathers and mothers and loved ones of those that we lost, and especially in Kabul at Abbey Gate. And you look at what happened with the dignified transfer to start with, and then the meetings that they had out in California. And a couple of things that really struck me right off the top was, number one, I was really, really disappointed in mass media. Only one television network, and it happened to be Fox, covered the meeting. And, and I really get frustrated that a lot of these major networks should have been covering this. It was only an hour and a half meeting. And when I listened to the discussion of those families who lost loved ones at Abbey Gate that day, it reminded me of the dignified transfer. And I told people, I said, look, here's what was so unusual about the dignified transfers. And this is the reason I was kind of upset with President Biden when he was looking at his watch and how he kind of treated it. When you go up to a dignified transfer, and that's when we bring the remains of those fallen back from the battlefield, they're in carrying cases. They are in ice. They are wearing the uniform they were killed in. There's been no change of their physical, how they look. So they go from the dignified transfer to the mortuary. So the families come up there as part of the dignified transfer. They see their sons and daughters come off the aircraft, flag draped carrying caskets. But before that, what's interesting is you go to a room, a little building, and it's very nicely apportioned, and you talk to the families, and each one is in a different room, and you go there and you sit and you talk to them. And they tell you, and what always struck me were they would come out and they talk about the hopes and aspirations of those they lost, of their loved ones, what they'd wanted to be. And it wasn't a downer. It was kind of it really kicks you in the gut, because when you talk to them, you just let them talk, let them bring it out. And I think where Biden made a huge mistake, and this is all on public record, Biden basically then he started talking about Bo. They don't want to hear about your family. Your job is to listen to what they say and what they do. And I'm also a little bit upset when you talk about dignified transfer. This is all public record. You can go back to the 8 years that Biden was vice president of the United States. He went to one dignified transfer, one, in the entire time, and all those we lost in Afghanistan and Iraq. So you listen to the families, you hear them, what they have to say. He never really did that. So you look at what these families are concerned about, and they just want to talk about, tell me about what happened. Tell me about the accountability. What occurred that day? They haven't been told that. So the president should do it, or the Secretary of Defense should do it, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs should do it. Somebody should sit there, sit them aside and say, look, this is what happened at Abbey Gate. This is what probably went wrong. The bottom line is there's been no accountability for what happened at Abbey Gate. No senior officer, no senior official has even been chastised, reprimanded for whatever happened there. And it was a debacle on how they got out of there, and it was all very, very preventable.
Yeah. I think you bring up a good point, General, when you talk about accountability. And accountability also leads to, at the heart of it is leadership. Mm-hmm. And I think given your comments just now and having worked with you over the last couple of years, obviously that lack of leadership from the commander-in-chief right now is on full display. The fact that he won't take any accountability for that, or anyone else at DOD for that matter, I think that speaks volumes to what some of these family members, again, in public settings have said is, who's at fault here? Like something went dramatically wrong with the picture. I wasn't even there, but I can see pictures. I saw the coverage. Something went dramatically wrong, and who's being held accountable to that, right? And I think if you're a family member, you want again, I defer to you. You're probably looking for some type of closure at some point, and to have this go dramatically wrong in such a very public way, but no accountability, probably is just continues to be in their crawl a little bit.
Yeah, and, Chad, you have to go back a little bit in time, and because I was kind of the White House guy responsible for Afghanistan because President Trump kind of gave it to me to do it, and I looked at what we did and the plan we had to leave Afghanistan because President Trump did want to get out of Afghanistan, but it was going to be in a very responsible way to do it, and that's when we came up with what was called the Doha Agreement and working with the Taliban to get out of there, and that was kind of all thrown away. One of those things that a lot of people don't talk about.
Yeah.
But the Taliban was very willing to give us control of Kabul to make sure we were evacuated. And they basically said, we're going to stay outside the city till you do it. And we said, no, we don't want to do it. Get our people out. So we squandered an opportunity. We squandered an opportunity to use Bagram as the evacuation base instead of Karzai International Airport, which is surrounded by mountains. And it's a really tough place to evacuate from. So you're looking at, I want to ask Milley, General Milley, the chairman, or ask Austin, who made those decisions for you to come out of Karzai instead of Bagram? Who made those decisions to tell the Taliban, no, we don't want to have control of Kabul, to let them get out of there? Because the fact is, not only did we lose 13 great Americans, but there was a lot of people who supported us that actually we left behind in Afghanistan, both Americans and those who supported Americans.
But regardless of who made that decision, it's on the commander-in-chief at the end of the day, is it not?
Sure, because people, as the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2 is very clear. There's one commander-in-chief. Ultimately, it's his decision, and he made those decisions because what I saw in the previous administration, the chief executive and those presidential decision-making, it's very clear who makes the decision. The president does.
Right.
And that's who's responsible, or at least he's supposed to be making them. And that's who's responsible for it. And you have to be very, very decisive about it. And what happened is now there's a gap. And what I mean by a gap now, and when you look what happened with Afghanistan, it created a lot of other issues that we now have to face. Because now adversaries look at what those decisions and say, are these guys, do they really have a team that's in charge? Are there really adults in the room? Does this guy know how to make good decisions? Remember, whether you like it or not, Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, former Director of the CIA, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, said, Joe Biden was wrong on nearly every national security decision in the last 40 years. Well, now that question then, so your adversaries look at that and go, well, maybe we can take a little more risk with this guy because he's not going to take hard action. And they will look at that and they'll push it. And I reminded everybody recently, I said, in the last administration we were all part of, we never lost a single embassy. Today, we've evacuated 5 different embassies and just left them. So I said, that's a real telling number.
That's such a good point.
Yeah, General, I love the Gates quote. Also, what was interesting to me was the White House said at the time, the president said he was never briefed on the potential for that to fall so quickly, for that to devolve into a hellscape that fast, which of course is fascinating. And when we were in the White House, I got calls every day from reporters who said, a source at the Pentagon told me you guys were this or you guys were that. And I said, that's not true. I was in the room, whatever. They couldn't be bothered, these reporters, to call any source in the Pentagon and find out immediately whether or not what the President of the United States said about never being briefed on this potential was true or not. That blew my mind. But something else that came out of that, which now we know he was briefed on that, so that wasn't true. A lot of the talking points coming out of the administration have to do with, well, our plan was exactly the same as Donald Trump's plan. Explain a few of the nuanced details of how they were different, because they were not the same plan, correct?
Hogan, that is an absolute lie. I'm not going to say it was, misinterpretation. It's a lie. And I was involved in every bit of the Afghanistan discussions from day one when we were in administration. A couple things, a couple highlights. Number one thing that Trump did when we got Mullah Baradar, who was the chief negotiator for the Taliban to come out of Afghanistan, he was the number 2 to Mullah Omar, the designated successor to Omar before Omar died of the Taliban. He was put in jail in Pakistan. President Trump picks up the phone. He calls Imran Khan, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, says, we need this guy to be our chief, the chief negotiator because the rest of the Taliban trust him. Khan took him out of there. So Baradar gets out. Trump picks up the phone again and calls Baradar one-on-one. It was in the Oval when it went on. translated because Berardi does not speak English. And he told him in no uncertain terms what he was going to do if this thing did not work out, some type of peace plan going forward. Didn't call him once, called him twice. Biden's never picked up the phone and called anybody in the Taliban. And then we put together what's called the Doha Agreement. And the agreement was between the United States and the Taliban. It was conditions-based. And if people say, well, I don't know that, you can pull it up online, unclassified, read the thing. And it says certain conditions had to be met before we were going to evacuate. And one of those conditions, there had to be for lack of a better term, a joint government between the Karzai government and also and the Taliban. So they're going to have to work together. And until that was done, we were going to withdraw down to 3,500 U.S. troops. We would hold Bagram. We would have our 3,000 paramilitary from the CIA, all stated everybody agreed to. So we weren't leaving until that coalition-type government had come together and was functional. And then we were going to back off. The Taliban knew that. We knew that. It's public record to do that. Now, don't listen to Keith Kellogg saying that. And you can pull this up. General Frank McKenzie, who was a commander of Central Command, retired 4-star, on public television said very clearly what the Doha Agreement was. It was a conditions-based agreement. There was no reason for him not to say that after he'd gotten out, and he got out during the Biden administration. It's there. It's public record. Just go look at it. So there's certain things that we did, the conditions-based agreement, the fact that we talked to the Taliban, we wanted to make sure it was going to work, and we were going to move out in a very responsible manner. And we had a plan to do it. We left that plan with the administration, the new administration. We said, here it is. You may not like it, and it may not be a perfect plan, but it is a plan, and it will work.
One point let me make, Chad. It's so funny because the administration consistently got rid of every one of our plans that we had laid, and all of a sudden they had to adhere to this one plan. That's also a little bit stupid and kind of disingenuous. On its
It'd been great if they actually listened to a border plan, too.
That's what I mean. We had that, too, but that plan wasn't good enough. None of these plans were good enough except for this one plan where they kept it verbatim, which is not true. Well,
it's great. I mean, President Biden, Jake Sullivan, and others said, well, we had to stick to this date. This was the date we were given. Like they had no other alternative, no other choice, no other conditions based, nothing else. And of course, I think we've talked about how the media really doesn't cover that. But something, General, that you said earlier, talking about the lingering effects and how other adversaries look at what occurred in Afghanistan. And obviously, I think most people would pivot to China and Xi. And what, talk to us a little bit about, at least from your perspective, what are our other adversaries, thinking about this as they see this unfold? They see, at least in my words, a weak president, weak leadership occurring. What are they doing in their own spheres?
Yeah, when I talk about presidential leadership, I think it's so critical. I think if the people are listening, just don't think of presidents. Think of football coaches or sports coaches or business leaders out there, and why there's certain leaders are effective and why they're not effective. And you look at somebody like, when I talk about presidential decision making, is if you don't make those hard decisions that adversaries look at, you puts it when you're tough about it, it puts a doubt in their mind. And is this individual going to react in a very forceful manner, or can we get away with doing something against them? And our adversaries see that, and they said, okay, we see him or he as a weak leader. And for example, I don't think you would have seen a spy balloon come across the United States of America in orbit for 7 days if Trump wasn't. We would have shot it down from day one. Right. And you see a lot of the things which are happening around Taiwan with the Chinese, or the pushing by the Chinese, the harassment of our drones. The Trump administration, we armed our drones. A lot of people don't realize that. We actually put AIM, air intercept missiles, the Sidewinder missiles on them. And at one time, we told, this happened to be in Iraq, that if you harass our drones, we're just going to shoot you down. That's pretty simple. Rules of engagement. So you don't fire. So now they won't do that. Oh, it's very, very provocative. Well, of course it is. I saw this president when we nearly lost our embassy in Baghdad, when paramilitary forces that were Iranian supported, that were Iraqi, when the president picked up the phone, called Mark Milley, was in the room, and he said to him, we are not going to lose that embassy. Pretty clear. And those are the kind of things that adversaries look at, and it causes them to pause. And that's what you want an adversary to do. Are they going to pause, or are they not going to pause? Right. And it creates a gap. And I think, I don't care if it's just the president, I don't care if it's sports or business, You don't want to see that in a leader. And we see that, and the trouble with it being the president, that is, quote, the leader of the world. And if you see that, it creates weakness.
Yeah, and so obviously when we talk about China, that's not only a concern vis-a-vis Taiwan, but also the relationship that they have with Putin as well.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and, there were 17 different phone calls. I mean, it's now burned in my brain, where I was in on a listening room, what we call the drop line in the White House. In other words, you had a phone there that when he would 17 times that President Trump was on with Putin. And he was very, very clear with Putin on certain actions, what he was going to take and not do. And I used to laugh about it because one time we realized he actually did speak English is because he corrected his translator one time who said, well, he must know what we're saying. But he was very, very firm about it. And so it creates a condition where I'm not too sure from the other side if I can take this kind of action because I don't know what kind of reaction I'm going to get from the most powerful nation in the world.
Yeah, so I think, sorry, Hogan, I think that's incredibly important. We were often told during the 4 years that President Trump was unstable, that no one knew what he was going to do, as if that was a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right? And I think what you just said, and I saw it certainly at Homeland Security, was the fact that he was willing to do things that were unconventional kept people guessing and kept our adversaries, or at least our partners, more willing to do certain things. And I think most people think it's actually the opposite, but it's really not at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's there were, honestly, Chad, there were times when I'd sit in the Oval Office and go, oh boy, here we go. But you look at that, and when people you always keep the adversary a little bit off balance, and he would do that. And I think he operated a lot of times, and we all know that from being around him. And I think it's important. Instinctively, he would make a call based on what he learned in life. And I think every leader sometimes operates by instinct from what they've learned. And you have to make a decision as Americans, who do we want out there leading this nation that has got decent instincts and will make the hard decisions in a very, very rapid manner, not a delayed manner, but very, very fast and very, very hard.
People often forget, Chad, in general, how, when the President of the United States speaks, it's not just the American people that hear him. It's not just the mainstream media or the White House press corps. It's the world. And so when they make comments, it has this cascading effect, this ripple effect around the globe where people are like, wait a minute, the president said what? And so when you have feckless leadership and you have a weak president, it shows other countries that we're weak. And I hate to say it because, look, regardless of political party, whoever is overseas as the president of the United States, you want them to signify or emote strength and cognitive ability to stand up for the American people and the American way of life with other countries who are trying to stand up for their own countries too. I don't think we have that right now, and that to me is one of the biggest glaring problems I see from this current administration.
Yeah, one of the things, by the way, it illustrates why strength is so important. When we went to North Vietnam, Vietnam now, to meet with Kim Jong-un on the second summit, and President Trump had gone out of his way to try to basically denuclearize North Korea and take them off the table, make sure that we could work together. But we sat there and we were going to have a closing lunch with Kim Jong-un. Trump walked out. He said, we're not getting anywhere on these discussions. And of course, too bad because it looked like a pretty good lunch to me. We're sitting there watching. and he said, no, we're not going to do it. We're just going to walk away from it. And it stunned Kim Jong-un. In fact, we learned later how surprised he was that President Trump was willing to say, no, we're not getting anywhere. We're not getting close to a deal. You don't want to talk about it. I don't need to spend any more time to do it. And it sent ripple effects all through the Far East, that here you have a leader that just wasn't going to just kowtow to another leader, but he was going to say, I'm going to take a stand and move forward on that stand, and he did it. And because of that, later on, remember, President Trump actually crossed the DMZ, first president to do so, and met Kim Jong-un.
I'm so glad you said that because I was there on that trip. And what was fascinating to me was that overlook from South Korea and North Korea. We were up there with President Moon. And I remember Kamala Harris this recently, she was up there at the same platform and they were talking about these things. And the vice president looked at everyone else and said something like, have you guys seen the pictures from the satellites? And they're like, what? And he goes, you should see what we're seeing on these satellite pictures into space. And it was just kind of a weird thing. And I compare and contrast that with Donald Trump was on that same platform. And President Moon looks over in North Korea and says, Mr. President, we used to have rockets flying over our heads in our country every day, and they've stopped since you've been president. And President Trump looked at the media and goes, tell them. Don't tell me. I know it. You know it. He goes, but no one else is going to report it. But that's some of the strength I think you're talking about that we're lacking right now, some of the presence globally.
Yeah, I think you're seeing that, and it's caused adversaries to push, and they're going to continue to push. And I think we're heading a very dangerous period of time on this next year, especially as we head towards another election, what our adversaries are going to do and how they're going to react.
Yeah, look, speaking of, I don't want to get too much further along before we have a conversation about your book. You have a book, War by Other Means is the name of it. Tell us a little bit about what it kind of outlines and the crux of the book.
Yeah, when I wrote it, and I didn't plan on writing a book, and I was sitting there, and we were actually in the Oval Office about a year before we got out, and President Trump said, one of these days you ought to write a book. I said, I don't write books. I don't want to do it. Well, then as we left the administration, I said, I think a story needs to be told here. So I decided to write a book that was basically the first part of it was about my life's journey through the military, what I'd done in the military, in the business world, and then in the political lane as well. But I think the important part of it, when we talk war by other means, it's kind of a takeoff on, there was a great, at that time, German strategist, Clausewitz, and he said, war is politics by other means. And I said, politics is really war by other means. So I kind of turned it, and you're actually in a fight. So when it says war by other means, politics. And I wanted to say this is the kind of environment we were in, and significant decisions that the president had made at the time, and I was part of that. When we actually deconstructed and defeated the ISIS caliphate, a terrorist caliphate that was larger than Great Britain, and we took it down within 2 years. The fact that he made a hard decision to kill Soleimani, who is actually the most charismatic leader in Iran, the third-ranking individual in Iran, because he had killed Americans and he caused problems with our forces in Iraq. He made the hard decision to go after Soleimani and sent a very clear statement, which he did. And when you look at those, I wanted to make sure you saw those decisions from everything we did economically or diplomatically or militarily to include COVID. Most people do not realize that the last month before we left office, we actually did a special operation in the country of Niger. We sent a SEAL team from Norfolk, Virginia, on aircraft, parachuted them into Niger to go after a single American who was a businessman who had been captured by thugs, not another government. And he said, I'm not going to tolerate that. I'm going to go get this American. And he did it. Most people would not even think about it. Yeah. Just go back and look at that. Look what he's done.
I think these are excellent points because it's something that's in the book, but I know it's also something that you spend a lot of time here at AFPI talking about, which is what is that America First, sort of viewpoint or set of principles when we're talking about national security and more specifically foreign policy, right? And I think you have a number of groups and individuals out there that say, well, America First, we need to only look at America and stay here, right? That more traditional isolationist view. Yeah. And I think the legacy media likes to paint the wide paintbrush. Like if you're, quote, America First, then you're an isolationist and you just want to hunker down. But that's actually not what you just described, right? With Soleimani and going into different areas, right? But it's a different way on how you use that power. I think that President Trump had in mind, and of course you were there side by side with him.
Yeah, I was asked that very question by a guy named Benji Sarlin for MSNBC in 2015.
Yeah, I know.
When he asked it very clearly, is this an isolationist movement? I said, no. America First is not isolationism. It means that the first thing we talk about is protecting the American people, which is the preamble to the Constitution, we the people. But it's designed to protect Americans first in everything we do. And then everything kind of feeds from there. So, and I think it's important for people to realize that when we talk about economically or militarily or diplomatically, that it's first thing we do is protect Americans and our way of life, and everything falls from there. But I constantly hear this about, it's an isolationist concept. No, it's not. And I told Benji at the time, look, this is not the America First movement of the late 1930s, where it was an isolationist movement. This is all about the people, and power emanates from the people, not Washington, D.C., but from Washington, Kansas. And when we look at, for example, then I'll just use military force an example. This president, the last president, President Trump, was very, very concerned on how we used American forces. We never started a war. We ended a couple of wars, but he wanted to make sure that it was always in the interest of Americans first. And I remind people, when you talk about the American First movement, you go back to, there was I use this, and Robert Lighthizer, former USTR, and I both read the same book, and we both liked it, called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, written by a guy named Kennedy. And he said, great nations fall because of strategic overreach. But Kennedy used the term imperial overreach. And what he means by that, if you spend all of your treasure overseas instead of spending it at home, then you will fall, because internally you fall. And I used to laugh when we used to fly back into campaign in 2015-16, that at that time candidate Trump would rail about LaGuardia, because that's where he kept his aircraft, Trump Force One, on the ground. There were potholes on the ground. He says, why can't we fix the potholes in the streets? And that's his whole point. Fix your streets, fix your inner city schools. It's all about America first. Then you can once you're good yourself, then you can look at nations overseas. That's the important thing. Yeah. It's national sovereignty.
So I think that's a good segue, and I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk to you at least a little bit about Ukraine and sending money overseas versus fixing the problems here at home. We have this debate today, particularly as it relates to Ukraine. Let me give you a hypothetical. If you were in the White House advising President Trump or President Biden, as this has continued to unfold now for a couple of years, what's the best advice? What's the one piece of advice you'd give them?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is, what did you talk to Putin about? And he kind of looked at me like I was nuts. He said, whoa, this is what I'm talking about. The first thing you ought to do is pick up the phone and talk to your adversary, or somebody that's your enemy. And that means pick up the phone and call Putin and say, what the hell are you doing? What's going on there? And then the second thing you want to do is you go to the American people and you say, Ukraine, and he should, and he's not done that. The reason why we are supporting Ukraine or trying to, because it's in our vital national interest because of. He hasn't done that. The third thing I do is, where's your defined end state? This is a major war. 300,000 soldiers, Ukrainian and Russians, have died. 1/3 of Ukraine are refugees. Cities have been destroyed. All right. I love what President Trump said recently when he said he just wants the killing to stop. I do too. I think it's important. So how do you get to an end state? There's been no end state defined. We don't know where we're going to actually end this thing as to aid. And we haven't talked to the allies and said, you haven't ponied up as well. We are giving so much aid, over $100 billion, of which $43 billion of that is military aid. It's unmatched by anybody else. And we ought to turn to the alliance and say, look, this is in your backyard. This is not in our backyard. So what are you doing about it? What's the importance that you should apply to it as well? And how do you do an end state to this? All wars will need to end. And I think he needs to tell the Russians what they did is they invaded a sovereign nation. President Trump was very clear when he went to UN General Assembly and was the first or second UNGA when he talked about the importance of national sovereignty. They violated the nation's borders. I don't think it would have happened. Remember, 2014, when Putin went into Crimea, that was under Obama and Biden, and nothing happened in the 4 years that we were in the administration. Right. He was very clear about it. And then you see when they invaded Ukraine. But I don't think he's explained it well enough to the American people.
I think that's a great probably set of advice, not only for the president but for others. I think I need to ask you one last question. It has to do with the border. I think you were probably part of these conversations going back to probably 2019, 2020, when President Trump was very concerned about the cartels and and asked for a variety of different options. Right. How do you target the cartels? How do you go after them? Obviously, you're a military guy. You know what the capabilities of the U.S. military are. You've talked about Soleimani, how he was targeted and taken out. We could point to Pablo Escobar. Some people have said, well, it's not realistic to have military might go in there and really address the cartels. It's more of a law enforcement issue. Where do you come down on that?
Yeah, Chad, I remember when we were in the Oval Office, we talked about the use of military force against the cartels. And of course, that's one of those, we talked about hard decisions in the White House. We take a really deep breath, like, oh boy, here we go. But I think we've done it historically in the past. You talked about Pablo Escobar. We sent a unit out of Delta, the first special operations unit out of Fort Bragg, first special operations detachment down there, led by a guy named Major General Gary Harrell, then was a colonel, who, by the way, was a big supporter with us in 2016, to go down, and they got Pablo Escobar. And then we tell the cartels we are going to do this. But you also tell the Mexican government, if you can't fix this problem, we're going to fix this problem, because how many Americans are dying? And I think you have to be resolute about it. And if the Mexican government cannot do it, and Obrador can't do it, then we'll do it for you. And we're going to do it. We're going to protect Americans. And it sends a very, very clear message, just not to the cartels. And I understand it's high risk, and I understand the threats behind it, but it has to be done to protect Americans. But think of what happens when you do something like this. And I'll give you a quick segue on that. It's exactly one of exactly partially the reason we did the attack into Syria when they used nerve gas against their civilians. Obama said that if you use nerve gas, it crosses a red line.
Red line.
They did use sarin nerve gas. Nothing happened.
Right.
They used sarin nerve gas when we were in power. We went after them. We hit the airfield there because then it sent a clear message to the rest of the world. There are certain things you will not cross. There are certain lanes you will not cross. Yeah. And we're going to make sure you understand that. So there's some parallels there that we did in the past. And I think it's responsible to talk about that for the American people. The amount of deaths have been caused by the cartels and drugs coming across the southern border.
Absolutely. Well said. I think there's a lot of Americans that would agree with you on that as well. So, General, I know you got a busy day. I want to thank you for coming on the tank. I want to thank you for talking to us a little bit about presidential leadership, obviously Afghanistan, a little bit on China, a little bit on Ukraine, a little bit on the border. So it was a quick time, but appreciate your service to the country, your leadership, and continued leadership here at AFPI.
Really
Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Hogan.
Thanks so much, General. Text the word TANK to 70107. That's TANK to 70107 to get exclusive content from the Tank podcast and to learn more about the America First Policy Institute.